SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon is urging Remainers to vote for her party in Thursday's EU elections, even if they're against Scottish independence, saying it's a vote to stop Brexit.
Scotland's First Minister has suggested she would still push for a second Scottish independence referendum, even if the UK ends up remaining inside the European Union.
Well, as part of our series of interviews with party leaders ahead of the European elections, we're delighted to be joined from Edinburgh by SNP leader and Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
How is Scotland?
Scotland is wonderful, thanks, Piers. It's very sunny, beautiful weather, beautiful scenery. I'm in the heart of Edinburgh right now, so you're very welcome to visit anytime you want.
Well, that's a very nice invitation.
Are you sure you're in Scotland?
It's always sunny in Scotland.
Now, let me ask you a hypothetical question, First Minister. It's this. Right,
I love hypothetical questions.
Good, I know you do. I know you do.
That's what elections are all about.
You're going to love this one. So, here's a hypothetical scenario,
okay.
Right? You get your wish, right? Scottish independence, right? But you also want to be part of the European Union, but they have already said they won't accept Scotland on their own. How does that work?
Who has said that? Who said that?
They have intimated they would not accept Scotland as an EU member on its own.
No, they haven't. Look, I don't mind hypothetical questions, Piers, but I do have a problem with questions that are based on entirely false premises. The European Union has never, ever said that. And, you know, while I don't expect the European Union ever to interfere in the decision about independence, I am more confident than I've ever been. And I was pretty confident back in 2014 that Scotland would be welcomed with open arms by the EU. If you look at the 27 member states of the EU, about a dozen of them are countries similar in size to or smaller than Scotland, so it's perfectly normal to be a small independent country.
But just to clarify, have you been given any assurance by anybody that you can tell us about that would be the case then, that Scotland would be welcomed, as you say, with open arms?
Look, we're not at the stage where I'm not going around asking for assurances. It's not for the EU to interfere, but if you can quote me anybody who has said that the EU would block an independent Scotland, then we can have that discussion, but you won't be able to, because, I mean, if there was a French politician just a couple of weeks ago saying that Scotland would be welcomed with open arms. When I travel across Europe, there's a real sympathy for the position Scotland finds itself in, possibly being taken out of the EU against our will, and I think a real willingness to see Scotland continue to play a part as a European nation.
Do you get why there's a kind of slight irony here, isn't it? Here you are, the great unionist. You want to keep the European Union all together, one big happy family working together. And the other half of Nicola Sturgeon is the complete opposite. You want to break up the United Kingdom. You want to sail off on your own. You want to do exactly what the Brexiteers want to do down here. I mean, come on. How can you be both? How can you be a unionist and the complete opposite?
No irony. There's no irony or contradiction in that whatsoever. The European Union is a collection of independent countries. They are independent. France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, every member state of the European Union is an independent country. Yes, they come together to jointly tackle some of the big issues that no country in the modern world can tackle alone. Climate change, for example. And if you look at Ireland, Ireland's an independent nation in the European Union, and it's been shown real support and solidarity by the EU. Contrast that to Scotland, which has been ignored and derided by Westminster.
If the UK is better off as part of the EU, which is what you argue, how come Scotland isn't better off as part of the UK?
The two things are not the same. The European Union is a collection of independent countries. If Scotland was an independent country, we would cooperate in the spirit of friendship with the other countries of the British Isles, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, but we'd also operate as an independent country within the European Union. There's no contradiction in that. The basis of those relationships would be that Scotland was an equal independent country. You go to any member state of the European Union and somehow suggest to them that because they're in the European Union they're not independent, then they're going to look at you askance and wonder what on earth you're talking about. But of course, the big opportunity, the immediate opportunity for this, for the people in Scotland this week, is to send a message loudly and clearly by voting SNP on Thursday that we do want to stay in the European Union. We want Scotland to be an independent, a European nation, and we want to reject Brexit. That's the opportunity people have.
So you say that you want to send a clear message. Apparently, 36% of SNP supporters voted to leave. So in fact, that clear message isn't even getting through to more than a third of your own supporters.
I think you find those figures probably have changed significantly given the experience of the last 3 years. But the fact of the matter is,
have you got evidence
the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland.
Have you got evidence
Let me finish the point. The overwhelming. If you're talking about SNP members, there was some analysis shown that of SNP members, I think it's around 10% would be of a leave persuasion. But the more fundamental point is that the overwhelming majority of people in Scotland voted to remain in the EU. And I think if that referendum was held again tomorrow, that percentage would be even higher.
But the overwhelming majority of Scots, the overwhelming majority of Scots in your own referendum voted not to do what you want to do. What makes you think there's been this dramatic sea change
I'm not sure
that's now got you wind behind your sails?
Well, there's 45% of Scots in 2014 voted for independence. Almost every single opinion poll that has been conducted since then show a higher percentage won independence. The most recent opinion poll, I think it was 49.5% support independence. But the point I was going on to make is that I think politicians have a duty to be straight with voters. You know, if you look at the position of Labour over the Brexit issue, they're trying to pretend that they are both in favour of remain and in favour of leave, and they're fooling nobody, and they're losing support and losing respect as a result. So I think politicians have a duty to be straight with people.
Well, I agree with that. Can we talk about
remain
on that
in
point?
the EU, and I want to see Scotland remain in the EU.
Right, on that point, let's talk about leadership for a moment. Right, you are widely respected, I think, whether people like you or don't like you, as a strong leader of your party, right? It is also widely believed down here, certainly, that Jeremy Corbyn and Theresa May are not strong leaders of their party. They've lost control of their parties. And that as a result, democracy itself is beginning to sort of disintegrate. What do you think of the leadership skills of your rivals?
I'm not a great fan of the leadership skills of Theresa May or Jeremy Corbyn. I don't think I'm betraying any secrets in saying that. I think neither of them have shown the leadership that is required. I think Theresa May has pandered to the Brexiteers in her own party rather than doing what would be right for the UK. And Jeremy Corbyn is trying to be all things to all people and is ending up satisfying nobody. But, you know, my job is to put forward a positive message for voting SNP on Thursday, and you know the SNP is in a very clear, unequivocal position when it comes to Brexit. We don't believe in Brexit. We think it's wrong for Scotland and the UK. So if you agree with that, then the way to send that message loudly and clearly on Thursday is to vote SNP. We're the biggest, strongest, most consistent anti-Brexit voice in Scotland.
Yeah, you said that you disputed the figure about 36% of SNP supporters voting to leave by saying that 10% of members voted to leave. Of course, you don't just rely on your members to vote for you, do you, when it comes to an election?
Of course.
You rely on supporters, so the 36% must still be a concern. And the Brexit Party currently second in Scotland, polling at 20%. So they are a significant threat to you.
Well, firstly, of course, you know, we have to understand why people voted leave. I wasn't trying to suggest otherwise. I was simply making the point that the clear majority of people in Scotland voted to remain. And I think people who voted to leave, whether in Scotland or elsewhere in the UK, they have been let down over the past 3 years. You know, I oppose Brexit, but it wasn't inevitable that Brexit would turn into the chaotic mess that it has turned into. So I think a lot of people who voted leave actually feel badly let down by what's happened since the Brexit referendum. And on the Brexit Party, I'm not here to talk about the Brexit Party. I think you've quoted one opinion poll at me. But on Thursday, my job is to say to people, if you are part of the majority in Scotland who don't want Brexit, who think it would be an utter disaster for Scotland, then the opportunity is to send that message very loudly by voting SNP.
You say there's no...
the Tories in Westminster that message unequivocally.
You say there's no contradiction between wanting Scotland out of the UK but the UK staying as part of the EU. And I wonder whether that is a slightly confused message for Remainers in Scotland who want the UK to stay part of the EU, but might be concerned that if you get a lot of support in these elections, you would then, you have a clear intention to continue pressing for a second independence referendum, because, there may be a lot of those Remainers who want to stay and they see a benefit in the union of the UK as well.
Sure, I don't think you're crediting voters in Scotland with as much savvy as they've got. The Scottish electorate, by and large, and partly this is a legacy of the independence referendum in 2014, are very, very well informed. People know what they're voting on Thursday. They know that the key message they can send on Thursday is an anti-Brexit message. Equally, people are well aware. I don't think there is a single person in Scotland or across the UK who doesn't know what the SNP stands for in terms of independence.
So a vote for the SNP on Thursday is a vote for a second independence referendum then?
The SNP have already got a mandate for a second independence referendum. We won that mandate fairly and squarely in the 2016 election. People know that, people understand that, people factor that into the decisions that they make. What I'm saying is I think you're underestimating the ability of voters to make these informed choices.
But I think
people
also
know
what
the
you're
opportunity they have on
underestimating
Thursday is to send a message on Brexit.
Right, but what we're seeing is this really kind of weird phenomenon that's engulfed, I think, global politics and indeed global life, where Donald Trump wins the US presidency and everyone who voted against him says, that's disgusting, we can't accept it, Hillary should have won, she won the popular vote, blah, blah, blah. Brexit, same thing. Brexit wins, we still haven't done it, all the Ramonas are saying must have another vote because people are too stupid. Right? Even Game of Thrones, there's now a petition signed by 1 million people to redo the last series because it didn't go the way the snowflakes want it to go. You lost a referendum in Scotland. The Scottish people voted resoundingly not to do what you wanted to do. And yet here you are saying, well, yeah, but they weren't informed enough. They're all a bit too stupid, so we're going to do it all over again and just keep going till you get the results you want.
It's me that's arguing that people are informed.
Well, no, you're arguing now that you're arguing that, unless I'm wrong, you're arguing they're better informed now, so more likely to vote for it. I would argue, though, that, again, I come back to a slight inconsistency here. You think the whole Brexit process has been a complete, catastrophic, chaotic mess, right? Yes?
I do, yeah.
Right. And it's been a mess because actually the country is split, right? Very, very hard split between Remainers and Leavers, right? Scotland, you had an equally bitter, horrible referendum campaign, split the country in two. Right? Why would you want to put Scotland through all that again when there's no sign in the polls at the moment there is a majority for what you want?
Well, there is increasing support for independence, but I don't actually agree with you on why Brexit has turned out to be a mess. Brexit has turned out to be a mess because people were fundamentally misled in the Brexit referendum, and secondly, there was no plan. Nobody had actually thought about what would happen if the vote was to leave the European Union. And then Theresa May compounded that error by setting all these nonsensical red lines. As I said a moment ago, I opposed Brexit, but it was not inevitable that Brexit turned out to be the disaster that it has been. It could have been handled much better and more competently. But let's nail this thing about not accepting results of referendums. Yeah. In 2014, people in Scotland didn't vote for independence, and, in case you haven't noticed, Scotland is not independent right now. But people have a right to change their minds if circumstances change, and I don't think anybody could argue that over the last few years, circumstances haven't changed, particularly with Brexit. And on the EU referendum, well, Remain won in Scotland. Remain won overwhelmingly, and actually Scotland is now facing being taken out of the EU against our will. That's why it's so important that
if it was not a referendum,
send a message that we don't want that.
Okay, so let's assume again hypothetically you win a referendum and Scotland votes outright and becomes its own entity. I think it's going to be a lot more complicated for you to get into the EU than you think. You would join the queue. There has a number of other countries that have already going through the process. There is a queue. There's a queue for other countries to join the European Union.
There is no queue to join the European Union. I mean, Jean-Claude Juncker, and I suspect you're not a great fan of his, but, I think people like him have made clear in the past, not necessarily in relation to Scotland, there is not a queue to join the European
So
Union.
you think you would just
Scotland's
literally,
been in
you think
the
if you were
European
independent, you
Union
would just
for years and
literally,
years and years.
right, just to clarify then, you
I
think
don't
if you were
think
independent, you
there
would
would be
literally
any-
just, you would ring up your mate Jean-Claude and you would literally just join the EU. It's as simple as that.
I don't think there would be any fundamental barriers to Scotland being in the European Union if we were an independent country. Why would there be? The European Union, almost since the moment it was established, has been in the business of trying to enlarge its territory, not chuck out
Okay,
countries
but what
that want
if you
to be
did?
members and have been members
And if
for
you were
the last 4
independent,
decades.
would you take Scotland into the euro then?
No, and again, no country can be forced to go into the euro, and there are examples you can look at. Sweden, for example, joined the European Union after the supposed obligation to sign up for the euro was in place. It's not in the euro. It has no intentions of going into the euro, and I think there is a direct quote from Jean-Claude Juncker on that one, saying that the EU is not in the business of forcing countries into the euro.
Can I ask, just before we let you go, Nicola Sturgeon, yesterday you'll have seen Nigel Farage out campaigning and had a milkshake thrown at him. We had an argument this morning about whether perhaps, the way that he campaigns, his campaign message provokes some people. I wonder, as a politician, for you going out campaigning, what you would say about that kind of activity, whether you see it as a legitimate part of democratic process or actually as an assault. And whether you see, when that happens, does that increase your anxiety about going out publicly?
I don't have an anxiety about going out campaigning publicly. I like going out campaigning, but every politician, when they go out in public, I guess, is at some kind of risk of something like that happening to them. Whatever you think of Nigel Farage, and I'm, as you've probably gathered, not a great fan of Nigel Farage, I don't think we should be condoning or encouraging people to behave in that way, not least because, it took the attention away from a big story yesterday about where the Brexit Party gets its money from. I think the better treatment for people who oppose Nigel Farage is to ignore him. He hates being ignored, and then go out on Thursday and vote against him. But all politicians of whatever party should be able to campaign amongst the public and have vigorous and robust debate, but not have to worry about things like that happening.
Nicola Sturgeon, it's always good to have you. You're one of the party leaders who comes on the programme.
And a straight talker.
Takes the questions, gives answers to...
It's always a pleasure.
Well, you know what? We actually appreciate it. We haven't seen Corbyn and Theresa May in nearly 2 years, either of them, right? They're bottle jobs by comparison. You're not a bottle job, so we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Nicola Sturgeon.
I like the fact she comes on. She gives as good as she gets. That's got leadership. If Jeremy Corbyn or Theresa May are watching, what is the matter with you? You've got these massive elections on Thursday.
You're very welcome.
Hiding.
You've got tomorrow. You've got tomorrow because we can't do interviews
Our
on
desk is
Thursday
available.
morning.